last NomCom round, and I thought, having been, in this community for some time, I thought there was a lot of work that could be done to get information flowing both directions, and so that was sort of my goal here. And I have my little agenda slide here. Is that like way too small? I'll just read it. So I'm going to do the goals and objectives, and then I added this one thing called "What is the IAB anyway?" because of some of the discussion I heard on the NANOG mailing list made me kind of think that I know that people really didn't understand what the IAB was and what they could do and what they can't do and what it's all about. So I have a very short couple minutes on that. Then I thought, well, it'd be a good thing to get some organized input to get all of this going. And I asked Jeff if he'd give us the overview of what Shim6 is and what the multi-homing strategy underlying Shim6 is, and then a couple of people who voiced interest in talking about this, Jason, Ted, and VJ. And then hopefully, so for a few minutes, I mean, my idea is that it's all bootstrapping, and then for most of the time, I'm hoping we'll just have a discussion about where we should be going, where we are going, what's right, what's wrong, and so forth. And then wrap it up. So that's kind of how I see this unfolding. So what are the goals and objectives here? Well, first, we were hoping to provide a context so we'd have an ongoing discussion about the evolution of the technical aspects of the multi-homing and the internet, because after all, it's the IETF, it's the internet. And of course, all the consequences thereof. And provide some additional opportunity for all of us to provide feedback to the IETF on the direction that we're going in with multi-homing and V6. And so this is an important note that folks really wanted to be driven home. The best way to participate in the IETF, and I think Jason mentioned this earlier, is to go to the working group, and participate in the working groups. And Shim6 is the one we're talking about here. There's a few desired outcomes as well. I'm hoping that, I think we're all hoping that we're going to be able to get an ongoing dialogue, so this won't be the last, but rather it's just the first of many. And so for the operator community, that's really too small, isn't it? Awareness about Shim6 and that effort, in case there's some education that needs to be done, how you can get more involved with the IETF and what the value of doing that might be to you. For the IETF community, I think better awareness of the operators' concerns about this technology would be helpful, and in general, input on any issues, operational issues that you might find with the emerging spec. And we realized that, I think realizing that Shim6 is not a complete answer, nor are any of the policies that have been proposed, and that there are many aspects of operational aspects of the Shim6 environment that are sort of TBD, and the one that comes to mind most easily is traffic engineering. So, rules of engagement. This isn't meant to be somebody told me that rules of engagement is sort of a military term. I shouldn't have used it, but I didn't know what else. I didn't know what else to how else to characterize this. So first and foremost, the IAB folks, including myself, I'm kind of got all the hats on right now, are here to listen to the concerns and comments about what's going on. And let's also make sure that we have the good bidirectional information flow, and that folks can get educated in the ways that they need to around this. And when we're discussing this, IPv6 is being deployed in some places, as we heard earlier. And so if we're going to have IPv6 deployed, we have to solve the multi-homing problem in some way. And Shim6 is about IPv6. I've asked this question myself on various occasions. Why don't we just do Shim4? And it's because Shim6 is being focused, the Shim6 working group is being focused on solving this narrow problem. And again, it may not solve all the problems, but it's designed to address site multi-homing, and there was even a question about that earlier, so that's interesting. Okay, so rather than go to Jeff first, I'm just going to give my little thing on the IAB here. So I don't know if you can read that, but what is it? I mean, I had that same question myself when I first started, but basically the IAB is the Internet Architecture Board, it's gone through a lot of evolution, and I'm not going to cover that because not only wasn't I there, but the history is somewhat murky in some places for me anyway. And so I thought the better thing to do would be to just take the normative reference for what the IAB is, and that's RFC 2850 or BCP 39, so you can look that up. But basically, what's here is distilled out of 2850. And so we'll get into the roles in a second, but first, how do you get on the IAB? That's a question. Well, you can either be selected by the NOMCOM. By the way, how many people know what the NOMCOM is? Okay, so the NOMCOM is the nominating committee for the IETF, and if we have time afterwards, we can go through what that's about. But it's an open forum for nominations of people to the ISG and the IAB. There's an there are ex officio and liaison members of the IAB, including the IRTF chair, which is currently Aaron Falk, and the IAB executive director, which is currently Rich Draves. And then there's some liaison members too. Usually there's someone from the ISOC, someone from the RFC editor, someone from the IANA, and someone from the IASG. So all of these folks are participants in the process that the IAB goes through. Okay. So to quickly look at the roles, I don't want to go through too much of this, but I'll just state this, and then you can look at my slides later. Basically, the NOMCOM provides a list of candidates for vacant IASG seats, and the IAB reviews that. It's involved in the RFC series. It's involved in the IANA, and it's involved in the standards process, the oversight of the standards process. In particular, the process is used to create the internet standards, and there's also these are administrative things, like there's a appeals board for complaints when there's some kind of concern about the way the process was executed. Okay, so here's the roles. Liaisons, there's the ISOC liaison, there's external liaisons. So this is like, we need a liaison to ITU study group 9 for some reason. IAB does that. So this is the part, the role that I think is most cogent here, and that's the IAB's oversight of the internet architecture. And it was said, I heard on the list, or I was reading the list, and somebody said, well, the IAB should, I forget where this thread started, but just should halt deployment of IPv6 or something to that effect. And I just wanted to make sure folks knew exactly what levers there are. So, as I said, check out section 2 of 2850, but basically, what are these levers? I mean, what buttons are there to push? Well, so the IAB can provide input. So these are architectural, this is where the IAB's actual executable architectural oversight is documented, and this is what we can actually do. We can provide input to the ISG regarding BOFs and possible subsequent working group formation. Okay, so I'll just note a couple of things here. I don't know if you can even read that. That's way too small, isn't it? So the way that working groups get created in the IETF normally is that there's a BOF, and then the conclusion of the BOF is, well, is there sufficient interest to do a working group? IAB members cover all the BOFs during the IETF and report back to the ISG, but you need to note that the final decision on working group creation is with the ISG, not the IAB. The IAB sponsors and organizes the IRTF, the Internet Research Task Force, and reviews the proposed working groups. The IAB can also convene what are invitational workshops, which kind of review technical issues. And here's a note of one, RFC, I forget which this one was, but it was 3535. IAB can also organize these ad hoc bodies of experts to look at technical issues. And so for example, there's a IPv6 ad hoc committee right now. And finally, I think this is finally, the IAB can also write informational documents. So if you look in the ID repository, you'll see things that look like draft IAB something. And those become RFCs, informational RFCs.
Sorry, Dave. I'm sorry I didn't catch this in an earlier draft of your slides. Leslie Daigle, chair of the IAB. I don't want people to take the second to last bullet in the wrong way. It is true the IAB can organize ad hoc bodies, mostly to discuss things, occasionally to adjudicate things at the level of appeals process where we fit in that particular appeals chain, but mostly, as I said, it's for technical discussions and just general elucidation. And another key takeaway is that the ad hoc groups that we have are not authoritative. They are informational and provide input to the IAB, et cetera.
Thank you, Leslie. That's right. I'll just say that standard track documents approval is IESG business, not IAB business. So if anybody has any questions on this or any other aspect of how this works, I will be glad to answer those to the best of my ability. I'm sort of a new person on the IAB, so I have neither the history nor the long-term view of what's been going on there, but I will do the best I can. So with that brief introduction, so keep in mind that the IAB has those levers to pull, and so when you're thinking about this and you want to give us some feedback, keep in mind what we can do. So now we're going to move on to Jeff. Just give us a little context on Shim6.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Jeff Houston of APNIC. I happen to be one of the co-chairs of the Shim6 working group. So in the time available to me now, and Dave has said 5 minutes. You did say 5. I'll try and give you a quick update. There are a number of ways that I could have done this. One was to do it purely as an architectural viewpoint. The other way is to actually give you a taste of the mechanisms that we're thinking of using. I adopted the latter approach of looking at the mechanisms, and I can't do it in words alone, which is why I'm subjecting you to a PowerPoint slide pack. Curtis Lindquist is the co-chair of the Shim6 working group. He sends his apologies. This is largely based on material that he actually presented to the RIPE meeting 2 weeks ago. Shim6 didn't appear by accident. It actually appeared as an outcome of an earlier working group effort in the IETF, which was called Multi-6, Multihoming for IPv6. There were many formulations of the problem, and there is actually an RFC, 3582, someone can correct me, about Shim6 requirements, Multi-6 requirements and objectives. But here's my take on what the problem was. Now, I must admit there are many takes, but here's my take. There are N-site configurations, be they small or large, that have multiple external connections. And what you'd like to be able to do is flip between those multiple external connections across connectivity failure, which many of you do right now with your own AS, or maybe not, and with your own what we call PI address space, and you just multiply announce the routes and do various forms of policy and traffic engineering with the routing space. So this is nothing new, and a lot of you do it right now. The second bullet perhaps is, and that's the twist. Can we use the existing IPv6 multi-addressing feature where a host can actually have multiple addresses and use connection-based aggregate addressing to avoid overloading the routing system with site-based specific advertisements? So in other words, can you achieve the first thing, which we currently use in the routing system, with a mechanism that is different to simply using the routing system to achieve the same end goals? From memory, I think 35 separate proposals were made into the Multi-6 working group, and reading through them, and I think there are about 4 of us who I think would admit to having read all 35, they varied in a wide variety of ways. Some were router-centric, some were host-centric, some were router plus host. The Multi-6 group, working group, concluded in effectively recommending back to the IESG to continue work in one particular approach, which was called Shim6. This was an outcome of about 5 proposals, and the generic idea behind it was that Shim6 was a host-based solution rather than host and router. quite deliberately insofar as when you think of the security implications, how do you know that it's my router being friendly or your router being nefariously helpful in ways that I don't want? So the Shim6 approach was basically saying, if I'm going to do this kind of work, it's easier to do it in my stack and do it in a way that at least I know what's going on, than have other people help me in ways that I might not want. So it's a host-based solution rather than host and router. A trickier decision, because at the same time the IETF is looking at the protocol called HIP, the Host Identity Protocol, which is transport-based rather than IP. And similarly, there has been work in standardization of SCTP, which is also a transport-based protocol. Shim6 solution is one level down in the protocol stack. It looks more like IPsec. It doesn't care how many upper-level sessions are active to that other host. It cares about that other host. So this is network layer rather than transport layer. It has good and bad implications. It makes IPsec very, very easy. But it makes understanding of what's happening in your current TCP session just that little bit harder. So it's network layer, not transport. Unlike HIP and unlike SCTP, it doesn't always happen. It's negotiated. So in other words, you try and start a conversation without any form of Shim6 capability, and then effectively you send a handshake or at least an exploration message going, hi, hello, do you talk this Shim6? If the answer is no, then you press on as always. If the answer is yes to the other end, you start doing more work. And last but not least, because the way this works is actually locator agility. If you can't bombard the routing system, then when my address that I'm using from provider A fails, I have to flick over to the address I'm using for provider B, but make sure my upper level protocols don't know, because otherwise they will fail. So you need some kind of consistency presented to the upper layer protocols, which we used to call an address. You need some kind of persistent identity across that. The Shim6 approach does not invent a new identity space. It reuses locators or addresses, as we shall see. So here's the approach. It's a functional module inserted into the stack at layer 3. In the area where you would used to see calls to IP input and IP output in the code, you will see another subroutine call. It starts off very, very blandly, as if Shim6 didn't exist. Hosts that are inside a multi-homed environment will have multiple addresses. And to establish communication, you need to figure out which address currently works. And happily, someone's already done that work. RFC 3484 says, if you have multiple addresses, here's what you need to do to start trying things out until you get a packet exchange. So Shim6 doesn't do anything different. When you start up, it's just 3484, same as normal. At a subsequent point, along comes Shim6 and says, hi, you appear to have been talking to this host for some time. Let me try and insert a Shim6 module in here for you to give you some added resiliency. So it's a subsequent negotiation on a host-by-host basis. Once it's installed, it then keeps the upper-level identifiers that you were talking on the same, but it translates them into packet headers, addresses in packet headers, that match the current forwarding capability. So in other words, you might at the upper level still think you're using addresses from provider A, but the Shim6 layer has detected a failure in that path and is now reinserting into the actual packet header onto the wire headers from provider B. At the other end, it'll be translated back and presented up to the upper layer as if nothing had happened. And just to make sure that you're actually translating the packets that were intended to be translated and not translating the ones that weren't, there's actually a context value that's inserted in there too, so that you generate effectively a tag, and that identifier pair plus the tag is the state identifier. And at this point, we're using an explicit end-to-end header to signal Shim6. any of you who followed this closely might have seen some efforts to try and use various parts of the flow label. It appears in IPv6, by the way, that the flow label is open space. Anyone who wants some cute idea with some spare bits, go and redefine the flow label. So many folk have been doing that the flow label is now hopelessly confused, and certainly we adopted a much more conservative view, at least initially in Sim6, saying we'll keep out of the flow label. Those of you who care about that would breathe a sigh of relief. So, what happens? You start talking. There is no Shim6 state active. You go through the multiple addresses until you find a pair that works, both source and destination, because sometimes it's the pairing that matters, not just the destination. You find something that works, you start sending packets. So at the transport layer, you're using an address, and at the IP layer, you're using an address. It just happens to be the same. At the transport layer, it's actually an end-to-end identifier, if you think about it. At the IP level, that same address value is being used as a forwarding locator. Same address, same 128 bits. Not a problem. At some point, inside not just that conversation, but that set of packet exchanges between those two hosts. So it may be multiple UDP sessions, it may be a single TCP, it may be multiple TCP, between the same two hosts, in fact, between the same two identifiers. Shim6 decides, either by timer or by volume, it's just a heuristic, that the session, or at least the host, wants resiliency. At that point, it does a handshake exchange. Do you Shim6? Yes, I Shim6. Here's some data. I acknowledge some data, and here's some of my own. A deliberate four-way handshake. That four-way handshake actually includes now a locator pool exchange with various cryptographic signatures that you can use to ensure that there's some integrity going on between the two. Now there's a Shim6 context. At least initially, while nothing is broken, the same identifier is the same locator. But now there's a header in there with context that says, I am now talking in a Shim6 capable fashion, so that if you get a break, if the packets stop moving in one direction, which is different from things going idle and the packets moving in neither direction, but if you get things moving only in one direction, or failure of keep alive, at that point you go into a reachability exploration at the IP level and explore through the locator sets, source and destination, until you actually manage to get a successful exchange of packets. That then becomes your new locator sets, so that at that point, once you detect failure, you explore for new locators and use that. The context field remains the same, so that now the packet with the different locators can then be sent to the other end. The other end with that context will actually recover the original identifiers and send it up to transport as if nothing had happened. It's magic. The control elements inside this, I think it's the last slide. Four-way exchange at the IP level to set things up. Do you Shim6? Yes, I do. Here's some data. Thank you very much. Here's some of my own. There's a dynamic exchange of locator list updates. You might get a new upstream. You might take one offline. When you find the address set changes, you do an explicit exchange. We are thinking about mechanisms for the upper layer to say, I don't think I like those locators, try again. Mechanisms to do explicit locator switching. There is a need for keep alive at the Shim6 level under certain circumstances. When you're getting unidirectional traffic, you actually need to keep the bidirectional flow working, so you insert keep alives to keep the context alive. There's a control element for reachability exchanges, because once you lose connectivity in provider A and you've got providers C, D, E, F and G, at some point you've got to explore those paths and make sure you find a path where I can send a packet and get a packet back. There is no explicit teardown. The Shim6 context, when you tear it down, is a local host decision. So I might at some point after you've torn it down, send you a packet with an old context. At some point then you'll have to say, that's a nice idea, but I don't know what you're talking about. Let's handshake all over again and re-explore and rediscover the context. So the last message there is a no context error exchange. The way we're approaching this, we're not doing traffic engineering yet, I suppose is the big message here. We're looking at a base protocol specification as the first deliverable out of this working group. So this is the protocol exchange and packet formats, the use of cryptographically generated addresses, and in particular hash-based addresses, to protect the locator sets that are being exchanged from various forms of subversion, and also working on a functional decomposition, in other words, explaining how it happens. We're trying to get those out straight away, or as quickly as we can, to form the base Shim6 set. There are a whole lot of things that could happen thereafter. Upper level protocols like VoIP might want, geez, switch really quickly, be very intolerant of outages. I'm carrying voice, I am critical. Other protocols like massive FTP might say, well, you know, I really don't want my TCP session disturbed an awful lot. I'd actually prefer you to hang around on an outage and see if you can recover more than constantly flicking locators on me, because that really gives me a hard time. So upper level signaling is certainly part of an extension or a refinement. I am not sure, a bit like Jason, how traffic engineering works at the host level. I think there's a lot of work to do in understanding that. But that certainly, once we understand how it could work, some potential refinement to the protocol that allows traffic engineering hints, i.e. this locator set is in a particular order because that's my preference. Please use it that way. We're also looking at the fact that right now Shim6 comes afterwards. The initial locator that you pick out of the DNS or set, at least one of those addresses must work. However, you might want to use a different set of addresses for being, the, if you will, the identifier, the local address context, the ULAs in v6. How could you set up these Shim6 without having an initial working locator set, what we would call contactless Shim6, so it comes up at the start? Various refinements on failure detection, and also the age-old problem that again Jason pointed to this morning. A lot of folk do ingress filtering. If I have prefixes from provider A and provider B, and I send provider A a packet where the source address comes from provider B, will provider A accept it, or will they ingress filter the packet out of existence? How do you do signaling and associated egress selection when you've got ingress filtering? And is there some concept of source address path selection going on? You will not find answers to these in the initial work coming out of Shim6, but you will find that these are, if you will, references to refinements that work may happen on later. So Dave, that's my brief overview of the functionality of Shim6. Thank you.
So, thanks, Jeff. What I wanted to do with this is I wanted to get a little bit of context of what Shim6 is and what people are thinking about, but what I want to do is I want to ask the speakers to keep it brief so we can get the, we can have the open mic time, okay? So, VJ, you're next. Pardon me? I'm making you next.
Okay, I'm Jason from UUNet MCI. Wanted to just go over very quickly the multi-homing problems. Inbound traffic engineering to the destination is currently, Okay, so inbound traffic engineering to the destination is not supported and is really needed day one. Without this, a Shim6 solution is not useful. The second thing is that currently multi-homing is site-based, not host-based, and this doesn't really lend itself well to current operational practices and processes. If you're an end site with a large number of hosts, a complex routed network, if you have end users that don't necessarily own the network or the traffic engineering preferences of the network, this solution does not lend itself well to your needs. The other thing is that currently the traffic engineering decisions are not configured at the network level. They're configured on basically the source host gets to pick what the order of the locators is, so he gets to pick what traffic engineering happens. There needs to be some sort of modification to the protocol to allow the destination network to share this information with the source, So if you configure this on statically on every end host, that's not going to be a great solution. And you also need a way for transit ASs to potentially do traffic engineering. And lastly, it can make firewall filtering difficult. I talked this morning about the differences between site multi-homing and host multi-homing. Not going to rehash that here. The other interesting point is transit AS traffic engineering may not be useful. In v4, you have the more specific routes. Each transit AS can look and figure out what the best path is, whether it's through provider A or provider B, and each AS can make its own decision, and they can bias those decisions using the BGP knobs. In IPv6, we don't have this capability. The end nodes basically negotiate a pair of addresses, source and destination, and that determines what ingress and egress ISP is used. So if some transit AS in the middle is delivering traffic to destination A, it's going to go through the ISP that owns A's address block. He can't instead decide to send it to ISP B because that's actually a shorter path or a better path or better for the destination. Packet filtering is very interesting problem space. You have to be able to deal with a TCP session that has migrated over to use upper layer IDs, and then the underlying source and destination IP address will change. So you may need to somehow map your existing sessions of non-failed communications when they fail over to what the new source and IP address is, and also take into consideration the upper layer ID. I wanted to kind of give a little insight into the solution space that's been kicked around a little bit. I'm not sure that any one of these solutions are real great. The first idea is that the destination host sends extra routing information to the source host so that he can choose the right address. The second thing is to try and migrate this functionality to the router. The third one is to have the routers change the network portion of the source and or destination address, sort of an 8+8 solution. And the last thing that's been kicked around is moving the shim function to the routers themselves. So for destination-based TE, actually getting the destination host to send that information, you basically either need to configure every destination host with some traffic engineering policy, or you need to have some sort of traffic engineering policy server that can push out the traffic engineering policy to all of your hosts. It seems fairly complex. There are some security issues, I'm sure, with this, and it still doesn't fix your transit AS capabilities. If you allow the routers to rewrite the shim exchange, in other words, to reach in as the packets go by and add to the locator set some traffic engineering information, this way you can leverage information about routing outages, you can configure your traffic engineering policy at the network level, but there are some concerns with this. What routers do the rewriting? Can routers in transit ASs do rewriting? There's some additional complexity that needs to be added to routers. And the other thing here that's interesting is if transit ASs can somehow poison the existing TLV metrics in the locator set exchange, then they can do inter-AS traffic engineering. Third possibility is move the shim function altogether to the router. In this case, the router would do the shimming on behalf of the host, or in addition to the host may shim, and then the router may put a network level shim. There's basically two big drawbacks to this. One is if not all your hosts are multi-homed, you need to know which packets you can shim and which you can't. And you need to make sure that all your hosts are multi-homed to all of your upstream providers, or you end up with some sort of IPv6 NAT-like solution. Also, you need to make sure that you can do this for every packet going through the router, which at 6 million packets per second might be a big deal. The last solution is sort of an 8+8 solution, where basically the router can change the network address for any packet going through. So if all hosts have the same host address but different upstream ISPs, you can simply swap out the network portion from ISP A to ISP B, and any router can do this. And again, the problems with this is you have to keep a lot of state. It's either an IPv6 NAT type solution, or all of your hosts have to be multi-home to all of your upstream ISPs. Also, rewriting source address may solve the ISP filtering issue, which is a bonus. But again, transit ASs are probably not aware that destination A and destination B are the same host and can't choose B instead of A because B is better. They just have to deliver to A because that's the destination IP address in the packet. Have to do this at line rate. what routers are going to do it. If it's a router in the core, you have to look past labels. It may make your authentication, HBA, CGA, much more difficult. It will break privacy addressing. It will break non-multi-homed hosts unless you keep a lot of state. So I'm not sure that any one of these solutions are great, but I kind of wanted to give you a taste of what people have been talking about. And with that, I guess I'll kick it over to VJ instead of Ted. But
No voting. We don't believe in voting. What's that? Oh, yeah.
This is a new laptop. Oh. Well, Bill did something right. First time I... Okay, so I'm VJ Gill. I work for AOL. And we have a different client base than most people. We either have very small customers, dial-up people, or we have very large customers, as in like cable companies. So there is no intermediate enterprise in the middle. So this is my take on Shim6 after going over it and trying to understand it. And I'm not a stupid man. I'm not very smart either, but this is beyond my capabilities of actual understanding because I tend to do things on an operational basis. I carry a pager. I am on 3 a.m. conference calls, for example, when certain providers go away. So I deal with stuff. Oh, hi, Nasser. I didn't see you there. How are you? So there are certain issues that I have to deal with at 3 in the morning that most people who are designing protocols do not have to see. So I tend to be very sort of pragmatic because if I can't understand at 3 in the morning, and most importantly, if I cannot break it down into Flintstones chewables for idiots, AKA my senior management, I can't actually run this as an operational network. So here's my take on Shim6. So no need to go over the summary. This is directly from Vince Fuller. This pretty much summarizes what Shim6 is. Jason and Jeff did a very good job of explaining it, so I'm going to skip this entirely and go on insulting more people next. So in my opinion, Shim6 is a Rube Goldberg contraption. I believe RS, oh, he's there, used this first, so I'm just going to steal it from him. We have issues with liveness and selection. Jason went over those very clearly and articulately in his slide as well. Issues. I used to work for a large bank. We could barely get DHCP working with a single IP address. I am not sure that multiple IP addresses are going to work as envisioned by the IPv6 working group people. Among other things, I don't know if people are aware that most large enterprises that I work with, banks and stuff, tend to run filtering on the switches so that they only accept a IP address from something that has gone out on that port from a DHCP. So if you get an IP address on a DHCP and then you try to send an IP address that has not been assigned via DHCP, the switch will drop it on the floor. I see Tom's nodding his head. Yes, this might play a little bit of havoc with trying to get it implemented, multiple IP addresses on host stacks for one, but this is just a minor issue. We don't really care about banks, at least I don't. Interoperation, trying to get this entire thing working on multiple stacks with multiple code revisions, I have my issues. The worst part is troubleshooting. Given our churn rates, hi Igor, can you hold for a second? Oh, okay. When you have low margin customers, and face it, we all have low margin customers, some are lower than others, but cellular providers and dial-up providers have extremely low margin customers. With a given churn rate of like about 2% a month, on average, one single support call from a low margin customer will destroy all margin on that customer for the expected lifetime of that customer. The more phone calls you get, the more customers go into negative revenue. So trying to debug our end user, look at the code in the bottom. AOL continues to send its users onto the increasingly speedy information superhighway in brightly colored beeping golf carts. These are not the people who are going to be trying to debug Shim6 issues. They will pick up the phone, they will call us, and well, there goes margin on that customer for that lifetime. Not something I am very supportive of, because I like my paychecks. So what's the solution? I believe either you go big or go home. You either bring back 8+8 GSC, whatever it is, in the modern day, or say, to hell with this, we are not going to implement an 80% solution that satisfies 40% of our customer base and imposes a support cost far out of proportion to the value it brings, in my opinion. Either let V6 multi-homing follow the current V6 track, which has scaling issues, that we'll discuss in the next slide, or we rework this issue. We go back to GSC, we go back to 8+8, and work V6 from scratch. This may or may not be politically possible, but I think Shim6 is an abomination and has really no place going forward. Either we go back or we just live with the V4 swamp and call it done. Any large ISP is not going to let end users control traffic flows. That's just not going to happen. Simply because of oscillation issues, the feedback loop between end users deciding, oh, this path is congested versus that path is congested, is too long. There's not enough feedback in the cycle. There's not enough quick response feedback to prevent multi-stage oscillation in multiple links in your network. I'm not going to let my people do that. The law of large numbers only works if I'm controlling the large numbers. I mean, it's fact. So, multi-homing is a fact. We are going to have multi-homing. There is no way around it. People will want to connect to different providers. That's just the way things go, because as you can see, these are the Homeland Security advisories coming out of providers nowadays. We can't rely on a single provider, so we will multi-home to as many people as we possibly can. We just have to accept it and go from there. The other thing is, the shirt is being worn tomorrow. And Nasser actually has already asked for the shirt, so he's going to get it. So this is a little bit of heresy. I know Vince and Randy are going to stab me for this, but there's not an infinite number of multi-homers. I don't care. There are 11,000, 12,000 ASs in use today, even though 30,000 have been allocated. So maybe we go to 60,000. I don't censor. The routing plane can keep up. Who cares? Most small businesses, most small businesses can't single home properly.
Please remember to state your name.
My name is Vince Fuller. I've been doing this for a little while. When those small businesses' livelihoods depend on their connectivity, they're going to want someone to solve this problem for them. And they're going to pay for someone to solve this problem for them.
Right. Well, apparently there are enough. I mean, I keep hearing this. And I talk to people who basically have, I have a lot of friends who are in the consulting business. I'm sure Dan can step up to the plate. There are even large providers who have no idea what they're doing. They're large.
That doesn't stop them from trying to do it twice.
That's okay.
Randy Bush. That doesn't stop them from trying to do it twice.
And
just look at the curves on actual occurrence.
And I'm saying that's fine. I'm saying I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, AS number growth is pretty close to linear, counting economic sort of issues. But the other thing to keep in mind is when you talk to enterprises, there's this idea that most enterprises now who count on the internet aren't multi-home. There's the discussion on the NANOG list. Some Gartner analyst came out and said, oh my God, you've got a multi-home. And everyone was panicking because how is this going to affect the rate of AS number consumption? They're already multi-homed. I mean, small businesses for the most part aren't, but medium and large businesses and small businesses that care about the internet are already multi-homed. This is part of their normal course of business already. So unless we're talking about home users needing to multi-home and wanting ASs, or my fridge needs a low number AS, something like that, I mean, we're talking about two different things. Maybe we need...
When you actually look at the routing table, we are seeing superlinear growth in multi-homing. Don't have to explain why, don't have to explain where, don't have to measure their IQs.
And Randy,
Just like us, they're all idiots.
Randy, that's the point. I don't care. I'm saying that the routing plane can keep up. The fib is more interesting. The fib is more interesting. I'm watching database. I'm basing the fact that the routing plane can keep up on my database transactional rates that I use. If the databases that I use can keep up with our current transactions, I have no doubt that a fast Pentium box can keep up with the routing table for the foreseeable future. The fib is more interesting. RS, can this wait till I finish the slide? Yeah. All right. The fib is more interesting. On the other hand, things like fib compression, you really only have a few hundred outgoing interfaces on a router. All these pads map to one of a couple of hundred outgoing interfaces. And in reality, the vast majority of the traffic is backbone pointing interfaces going out of the box, and those are on the order of tens. Forwarding convergence may be slow. And this is where you can actually have people say, my prefixes are more important for, I will pay you to converge those prefixes faster. There's technology available to do this today. Cisco has that implemented. They currently base it on loopbacks and /32s, which they deem more important for installation in the forwarding table. There's no reason why we can't tag. This is an implementation detail. We can make this work.
Let's take this one, and then I want to move on to Ted so we can get the...
As counterpoint to what Randy just said, Rob Seastrom, by the way, the superlinear nature of prefixes in the global routing table is very tightly coupled to AS's advertising more than one prefix. Superlinear growth of prefixes. Yes, well, you said that due to multi-homing, that it was superlinear. Can you clarify what you said?
Yes.
In multi-homing.
Yes, and I'm saying I don't care, because no, I mean, I agree it might be superlinear. I think the technology can keep up, and I think every time I see this exponential growth curve happen, something will flatten it out. It's the same thing with like the internet growth in the mid to late 90s. People are saying it's going to grow at 100% a year, or like 1,000% a year, and keep growing. It does, but it's an S curve. You have the initial curve, starts are slow, expands, and then it matures and then falls off. And I believe the technology will allow us to ride the curve till it falls off. And if not, Shim6 is not going to buy us anything more. We have to go back to first principles. We have to separate endpoint from locator. We have to go to GSE. That's my take on it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vijay.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that is the only correct answer. If Shim6 is going to buy nobody anything.
Right. I think what Randy and I'm not going to put too many words in Randy's mouth, but I think what we're saying is that it's either fix the problem for real with something like 8+8,
right,
or we're all
Don't bother.
screwed 5 to 10 years down the road.
Yes.
Because basically, if you count on IPv4 style multi-homing to save you, it's not going to.
Correct.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Okay. Hey, I want to give Ted a chance to show his slide, and then we'll continue.
It's just quick and dirty.
'Cause it
Two
won't-
slides. Because Jason and VJ already beat this thing to death a little bit, but I'll just add a little bit to it.
By the way, I had while Ted's getting this thing going, I had a pretty good idea of what these folks were going to think about this and what they were going to say. And I went off looking for someone who might be their counterpart, and I couldn't find anybody. So for the next time we do this, which I hope there'll be a next time, somebody, somebody please recommend the right people.
Pick the right people to stir up the pot, huh? Is that what you're saying? So everything that Jason and VJ said, in my opinion, is true as well. I believe what they're saying and agree with it wholeheartedly. I think some people are also missing some of the problem, and that it's not just a V6 problem, it's also a V4 problem, and sooner or later there's going to come a point in time where both are prevalent in the world. And I think that's as big a problem as well, and it's being ignored. How do you do both at full table, at full scale? I don't think the boxes we have today will do it. Just because someone got V6 addresses doesn't mean they're going to give back their V4. That's reality, and that's the business world, in the world we live in. You can try and move the state to the edge of the network, all the Shim6. At scale, this probably isn't going to work either. Just ask the large content providers how that's going to work. I think you'll get a whole different perspective from them. Wait, not yet, not yet, not yet. You'll get your chance. And the other thing, as Jason pointed out, but I will reiterate it, customers pay you for the ability to control their traffic inbound from you to them. You lose that capability here unless we add yet another knob or another field into the protocol to address that. The other thing is while this V6 introduces adequate address space, you know, you look at the number of addresses and elements that we're going to have in the real world. Is this realistic to assume you can do this with Shim6? When you introduce mobility, I don't know how you're going to do this. And then there's these little things in the future, man. If you play this thing out, if you believe there's going to be a V6 address on every RFID on the planet, man, this ain't going to work. Which is probably what's going to happen sooner or later. So then you got to ask the question: are we better off going back to the drawing board and trying to delineate between endpoints and IDs? I don't know. And which just takes me to my next slide here. Isn't new technology supposed to be better than the technology it replaced? Is this? Right? And my other favorite dig is brought to you by the former protocol or connection list protocol known as IP, since we're all trying to turn it into the telephone network all over again. That's all I got, guys. Open it up.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you for that, for all of that. So, okay, you're first. Please, thank you, Ted. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, I'm Igor with Yahoo, one of the large content providers that was mentioned before. While it's great to take a lot of load off my router, please don't multiply the load on my servers times 100 to have to keep track of all this. Because while it's great that, you know, and my laptop will only have to maintain 20, 30, 40 extra sessions, my servers will have to maintain 200, 300 times the extra session information. And yeah, I'd rather pay for bigger routers. And on top of it, there's this minor issues of initial connect, where if you're going to try probing every possible path to every possible destination, and you may take a couple of seconds to do that, my end users will go somewhere else. And I'm just going to request more IPv4 space. And finally, somewhere out there, somebody's going to need to connect to some box to get all this information. How is it going to be multi-homed? Yeah, we're trying to solve a problem that, like Vijay says, could be solved with technology as it progresses. You're trying to replace something that works with something that absolutely will not work. It is horrifying. And while we may be big enough to avoid the problem by getting a couple of 32s, because...
Was that horrifying?
What?
Is that what you said, horrifying? Just want
Yeah.
to make some notes here.
Yeah, horrifying. But for somebody like Yahoo and Google and MSN, yeah, we're big enough. We could get address space in V6 to multi-home properly, the old-fashioned way, which works much better. A lot of the small guys can't, and they're going to be screwed. Because Shim6 does not, in the way it is right now, does not work and will not scale.
Randy, go to the mic so that everyone can have the benefit of your comments and wisdom.
Randy Bush, yet again. Igor, you're going to be trying to delivering packets to all those V6 shifters out there. You've got the problem.
Yes,
You can't just pretend you don't. This
I will have a
disease,
problem with the full-
spreads very quickly.
I want to exercise a little bit of my chairperson BOF authority here. I want you guys to all stay in line, but I'm looking for somebody who wants to speak in favor of Shim6 out there. No, really. No, don't sit down if you have comments. I was just hoping that there'd be somebody. Okay.
Okay,
One second. Let this gentleman go because he hasn't, and then you can go next, Jeff. Really.
So I'm Dana Blair from Cisco. The idea that Shim6 is solving of disassociating the IP address from the forwarding is a good idea. If you try to solve multihoming with it, then you see all these issues. However, the problem's already been solved with SCTP as a transport layer. So I don't see a reason for another solution to do the same thing. If you want multiple IP addresses per session, then deploy SCTP and use the add IP function.
So that's like what Jeff described as a transport layer solution. Go ahead, Jeff.
I'll speak in defense of this, but I need to go back into first principles. How do you actually make the routing system scale if you can't use hierarchies? And no one has given us an answer. That's problem number one. Problem number two, how do you make the routing system into an economy? It's fine to pay for a routing slot, but pay whom? Who's pushing, who's pulling? The blunt fact of life is there is no routing economy. I can spit out whatever crap I want, and so can you, and no one pays. It's a victimless crime. And we know it doesn't work when it doesn't work, but not until then. So there is a problem out there. We scared ourselves beatless in 91. We scared ourselves in 95. We scared ourselves in 99. And we're back on an exponential trend again. So we go through these continual shocks of going, oh my God, the routing system's failing. What can we do administratively to solve it? And none of us has any clue. None whatsoever. There's no economy out there. So a whole bunch of folk go, maybe I can solve this a different way because we can't figure out what a routing economy looks like. And the big clue appears to be that we need to understand the difference between identity and location. I don't think Shim6 is the answer. I don't think HIP is the answer, and I don't think SCTP is the answer. But I think, very fundamentally, that if we don't separate identity from routing forwarding, we're going to die. And we're going to die before I retire, which is a real problem for me. So somehow we need experience in trying to understand how to do that separation. And I'm not claiming that Shim6 has got it right. I think there are a whole bunch of problems there, but there are a whole bunch of problems with 8+8 as well. The whole issue about security, about how to do that binding in a way that everyone understands that it's between you and me and not between someone else interfering is a problem. But we're not going to get robust solutions unless we look around. So I'd speak in defence of Shim6 as being one way of looking at this. I wouldn't say and claim now it is the way. I don't think it will be. But unless we try things, you're going to be stuck in the routing panic of 2008 and the routing panic of 2010 and the routing panic of 2015. This is an endless cycle that you're just going to die on.
I'll just make one comment on that before Jared. I think what I've been hearing, I didn't hear anybody disagreeing with what the statement you just said, but what I thought I heard was a lot of people feel like the cure is worse than the disease. This particular cure.
It's not the cure.
Well then,
we've got to
understand.
No, when you try and really do a fundamental change to one of the basic tenets of IP architecture, that the identity and location was the same. That was one of the cut-throughs that made this technology work. It's very simple, very easy. But the routing system is suffering. When you try and break that apart again, how are you going to do it? I don't think we can devise a perfect answer these days. We're too big an industry. There's too much hanging off it. You've got to look in multiple places. This is an exploration. And I hope we learn from it. But I, for one, would not say it is going to be the cure. It's not.
Right. Well, I mean, a couple of points about security in GSC. We don't have the security in V4 today because we are currently, for example, AOL is hijacking sessions transparently for SMTP, outgoing SMTP and redirecting to our relays. So you go to smtp.yahoo.com on port 25, it ends up transparently hijacked to the AOL relays. That's to prevent spam. For example, certain large communist nations are hijacking 10 out of 13 root name servers and are returning transparent answers, which it doesn't look like they're going to the wrong IP address, but they're going to the right IP address, except it's just not the right servers.
So,
So bad things happen in the forwarding plane, yes.
Yes, what I'm saying is that waving the red herring of like no security in GSC or 8+8 is not, I guess, really relevant because we already have the same security problems today. People who want security will go application level end to end. For the most part, it'll just quote unquote work because it's cheap and it's good enough for 90% of what we need to do. For the remaining 10%, you will use end-to-end security.
So I just wanted to point out to folks that there's some pretty nice null-isms that I have a whole folder for null. But, pardon me? Yeah. I keep on getting Vince with more suggestions here, but this is the one that I think folks ought to look at. This is a pretty classic piece of work, and in some ways, the URLs, I put that up there so you can see the URL. I don't know if you can read it, but it really outlines what this is all about. It's a good document. So, pardon me? Yeah, this is the non-RFC one. Yeah, this one never got published. Anyway, let's see. I'll take Jared and then Tony next. Okay.
Hi, Jared Mach, Vario. Speaking with my primary background is network operator, so if something like shim6 goes through, I assume there will be a wonderful breadth of new tools such as shim6 traceroute and other things to help my users diagnose all sorts of problems. And one of the things, just when I even try and wrap my brain around that, is I think about all the wonderful things other providers have done, such as turn on hiding of TTL and how long that lasted in various networks for troubleshooting and stuff like that. And I think of all these and all these fun things of, your machines broadcasting an IP address banner ads that we see on all these wonderful websites out there. But I mean, it seems like the real solution might actually be some sort of new routing protocol, because all I really see here with any of the IPv6 stuff is the exact same protocols implemented, but just with different headers with more bits. And that seems to be it, and the only potential plus is that people are giving out allocations that are so large that, at least right now, we could subdivide them past the 64 and do whatever we wanted so we would have endless amounts of IP addresses, because I don't need a /64 at my house, at least not yet.
Tony.
Okay, Cisco. I'm not going to speak in favor of shim6 because I've been violently against it since it was conceived. Not because I think it's necessarily a problem in its own right, but it ends up changing the fundamental architecture such that you end up having to rebuild all of your security tools from scratch. Not that IP is responsible for security, but everything you've got that is responsible for security has some degree of concept of persistence of that space, and now shim6 is out there intentionally changing that persistence and breaking all those tools. But that's not exactly why I got up here. The primary issue was
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Do you think that's a property of shim6 or a property of splitting locator and identifier? And is that a shim6 property is what I'm asking?
it is explicitly a shim6 property, but in fact it may be more locator and identifier, because if the security tool is really trying to identify the identifier, which is what it in theory is trying to do, is verify the identifier, and you've moved that somewhere else, you've got to go redo the tools no matter how you approach that problem. The biggest issue is you're actually just pushing the problem around, right? You get different perspectives on what efficiency means, different perspectives on what is the right answer for multi-homing, based on whether you're a service provider or an end customer or whatever, and everybody's perception about what the right answer is going to be in conflict with somebody else's in this room, right? So there is no single right answer, and you're going to end up with a collection of things that are probably different than what you've done in V4. Right? So don't come into this assuming that there is one answer we can get to, because if you look at all the requirements coming from all the different directions, they are explicitly in conflict. And you can't get an answer that satisfies everybody. You just have to pick something in the middle. And that's kind of how Shim 6 got picked, was it's in the middle, and it doesn't look like it's too bad for anybody, but it doesn't really solve anybody's problem. So,
Tony, stay put for a second. So I just have a question for you then. Do you think that we need a site multi-homing as well as a host multi-homing solution? In other words, two separate solution spaces? And is it worth all the complexity?
Host multi-homing was actually already implemented, and Shim 6 doesn't really help that per se. It allows you to do some failover things that the application isn't aware of, but multiple addresses on the host was defined in V6 to begin with. So host multi-homing was already there. It's just a matter of how transparent it is to application failover. Site multi-homing is required, if nothing more than, as a traffic engineering step, because it's the only way we've got for doing traffic engineering at this time. Given the routing tools we've got, that's the mechanism. We're trying to do traffic engineering based off of a stable IP address. And you're kind of stuck. Right? If we had a different way of doing traffic engineering through a different routing protocol, and I'm not suggesting I know one, I'm just saying that the big argument coming out of this group so far is I can't do traffic engineering the way I've always done it because now the hosts are doing it because of this Shim 6 or even just standard multi-addressing from the host. And I do traffic engineering because I'm the operator community, and you're now taking my tools away from me. And I'm just saying that's what's happening here, right? That's really the message: is you're taking my tools away from me, and you're not giving me anything back. And what you've got back is exactly what you've had before. You use the same site multi-homing. You just give everybody independent blocks, and there's 12,000 extra entries in the table. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Dan Golding, a related point there is that it seems like we've got a perceived routing problem that may or may not turn out to be a real routing problem, and so we've said that, okay, someone's going to have to kind of take the hit for this. And it seems like the folks who we've decided are going to take the hit are, to some degree, operators, and to a larger degree, their customers. If this was 5 years ago, before lots of enterprises and content hosters were multi-homed, it wouldn't be such a big deal because people wouldn't be used to the freedom that they have now to drop one provider and get another provider because they have truly provider independent space. But part and parcel of this whole thing is the fact that the idea of provider independent space kind of goes away here. And if that's happening, that will hamstring enterprise and content provider adoption of IPv6. And we say things like, well, Yahoo can maybe finagle a /32, but the way the RIR policies are now, they can't, and they can't because of the routing issue. And of course, Ford and whomever else definitely can't. They are not going to do this. And it's not that I'm supposing this. They've said this. They said they absolutely will not go to V6 unless they can have provider independent IP space and true multi-homing, because it ties them too closely to providers who may not have financial stability. They just can't do it anymore.
Right. Heard it. Go, please.
I'm David Conrad. I am not affiliated. I think I think for as long as there have been net masks, there has been actually a separation between locator and identifier. The routers within a core of a network didn't care about the host part. The hosts didn't really care about the network part. Where that broke down is in the computation of the checksums within the pseudo headers of TCP and UDP. I think that an approach, and I have my own pet approach on how to solve this particular problem, but sort of the key consideration is if you do separate the locator from the identifier, it's important that you maintain, within the core of the network, it doesn't actually matter what the identifier is because nothing looks at it. It only looks at the locator. And within the endpoints, the only thing that matters is that the identifier is constant, and you can establish security credentials, as you wish based on the identifiers. You don't want to base it on the address. As we have seen, you can spoof that in various ways. don't think Shim 6 is the right approach, not because it disables a bunch of tools. I mean, there are a large number of software engineers who are looking for jobs, would like to write tools. My concern is that it adds a level of complexity within both the network stacks as well as with the operations of the network that would make it very difficult for me to imagine that the internet would actually survive.
Yeah, even ignoring the operational issues of Shim 6, ignoring traffic engineering, ignoring the routing table load, I think we're all ignoring something that really needs to be said. Shim 6 does not solve the problem of multi-addressing and failover here. Most sessions on the internet are short-lived. How are you going to establish the entire failover when you only have 10 packets to do it in? And Shim 6 does not address the problem. Shim 6 will not be able to initialize in those 10 packets, and the conversation is over. And that is a fundamental design flaw with Shim 6. So Shim 6 causes operational headaches, and it doesn't solve the very thing we're trying to solve. Yes, it will fix things for long flows. Those are much fewer and far between than the short flows that we have. Yeah. Another issue that we have is people suggest, well, we can do connectionless Shim 6 where you could just do a DNS lookup and get an answer back fast. Great. How do we multi-home those?
Yeah, I want to ask a question, kind of a general question for the audience, more or less, and some of the specific people in the room. Given Jeff's comments and the comments made at the mic so far, it's pretty plain to see that the internet community or the operator community doesn't like Shim 6 or accept it as a real working solution for any length in time. So given that, and I know I myself, I have broached this with members in the IETF as well, what is the aversion to re-scoping the problem and addressing V6 as the problem and stop these stopgap solutions? What is wrong with going back to the drawing board and doing this over and doing it right? Is there anybody in the room who can answer that question?
As long as it doesn't impact our existing installed customer base, which is pretty minimal. Are you one of them? We have more than 3.
I mean, there are a lot. Okay, go ahead.
The answer is, your question is, why we're not going back and readdressing it. And it's because it's not an easy problem. All the hard parts got avoided in the V6 whitewash job in 1994. And the IETF as an organization has gotten to the point where it is not going to come up with brilliant, elegant solutions to anything. And there is no group working on this stuff in that fashion that isn't just blowing smoke. I love to quote Noel too, but he never finished. Okay, and the reason there's no magic solution is we're stupid and we've settled for mediocrity and complexity. This is just an example of it.
But then it's broken.
V6 actually solved the problem it was intended to solve.
Addresses.
The problem it was intended to solve was the press was saying the internet was going to collapse for lack of addresses. The press no longer says that. The problem was solved.
I think Leslie, do you want to respond to that, or then I want to take these folks who've been waiting. Okay.
I'd kind of like to rebut it a little.
Okay.
Leslie Daigle. While I agree with a lot of what Randy said, I think I would extend it a little further and point out that something that Jeff said earlier, and I think Tony said it too, is that this is a lot of the issues that have been discussed this afternoon, a lot of the heartburn people have with Shim 6 is the fact that we're taking something that was perceived as a fundamental tenet and, you know, splitting the atom. And no matter what you do, there will be pain. And unless and until we, the users of the internet and the technical folk working on the internet, can get some kind of agreement on which bit of pain we're willing to take, we're not going to make progress. We're going to just have meetings describing why all the ways of doing things are completely broken. And there is simply no magic. There is no magic bullet, because if you split apart the locator and identifier in the shim6 way, whatever happens to what you have to do to rethink how you do routing and optimizing for multi-homing, there are problems further up the stack. Pain is conserved.
Leslie, the operator community spoke and was stuffed. The operator community was speaking here today, and you'll notice, though, many of us disagreed about which part of shim6 we thought was fablungent. All of us said 8 plus 8.
I do believe that made it into everybody's notes who were taking notes today, so I don't think that's going to be
And they should have made
missed.
it into everybody's notes 5 years ago and 10 years ago, but the notes ain't doing no good.
Well, I'll just say, let me inject something here, folks. Hey, wait a second. Let's let everybody have the benefit of hearing what everybody is saying, okay? So one of the reasons that we all got together and decided to do this was just exactly so we could get this feedback, and just exactly so we could understand if there's any levers to be pulled, right? And so I think I understand Randy's concern. I understand what's going on, and we're trying, at least I think we're trying, to address those very issues. So the feedback and the back and forth and all of this stuff is very good. It's positive stuff. So the question is, you know, what happens next? So Leslie, if
I'd like to say something, but I want to go after.
Okay, please go ahead. I know you've been waiting patiently.
Eddie Drigger. A few things about shim6 seem to resemble things that either don't work too well or just outright fell by the wayside with IP4. For instance, and I'm not picking on the manufacturer of the equipment, but I don't know if any of you have ever had downstreams running fat pipe boxes, and inevitably those end up causing support calls because someone's IP address, source IP address, changes. You know, they hit a website, go back with a new IP address, but the cookie that they have is for another IP address. So changing IP addresses in rapid time has a way of breaking things at the application layer. Other things about shim6 kind of remind me of source routing, and there are both leaf and transit networks that don't support that, as well as for inbound traffic tuning. Whatever happened to DPA, Destination Preference Attribute, the BGP attribute, you know, that fell by the wayside back in the late 90s. If we're not going to get that right at the site level, why are we trying to run ahead and now do it with finer granularity on a much larger, much more complex scale at the host level? And also, maybe what we need is not so much locator per se, but one of the nice things about MPLS, for instance, is when forwarding in the core, rather than having to look up one route out of 170,000 possible routes, each route or each hop of the way, which is, you know, kind of stupid, we can tag packets, and then, okay, you have a tag that pretty much corresponds to the egress, and all of a sudden you don't have as many lookups. Similarly, for providers who have single-homed customers who are connected to two different POPs, so perhaps someone has a downstream that's connected to both LA and San Francisco. You assign them a private ASN, and you can use that private ASN for all your customers because the routing policy is the same. The location is different, but the routing policy is the same. So if we have someone who wants to multi-home to SBC and Cox, we don't need separate routing policies for each of these 50,000 people who want to do the same thing. We could collapse those into one distinct routing policy.
Okay, thank you. Please, go ahead. You've been waiting patiently as well.
Thanks. My name's Chris Woodfield. On the list last week, I forget who started it with a relatively new idea, and I can't claim to understand the whole thing, but what I think I did grok, if I understood correctly, was that the source of the idea was that using the source AS and a prefix for part of your path decision. In other words, if you have 50,000 routes, or 500 routes being advertised from a single source AS, why do you have to do individual lookups on each prefix? Why not say, okay, this prefix belongs to this AS, how do I get to that AS? And when VJ was talking about the problem with the forwarding table, I thought that could be an interesting way of solving it, as long as you don't have a situation where you have more and more multi-homers only advertising a single prefix, so you get far fewer prefixes per ASN. But I just want to think about the fact that you can't use no system uses that source AS as any part of the lookup decision other than evaluating the AS path length. And I'm wondering if that idea has ever been explored.
I don't know the answer to that. Oh, Adams, right. Yeah, the CADA folks had it in Adams, you're right. Search for Adams in the CADA website. It was I think it was Andre. It came from Andre. Yeah, but it came from Andre, I think. That's right. Pardon me? Okay, thank you. All right, so our time's kind of ticking here, so I want to get Chris and Leslie, and then go ahead, please.
It's easier to pick the mic up for me. I wrote a whole bunch of notes, which most everyone has already said. And so my concern about Shim6, which I think was very well articulated by everybody up there and a lot of people down here, was it doesn't seem very workable. I think that everyone would agree that if we just blew the routing table up, that's not really that workable either today. So there's some intersection of time to get to blow up and time to have a solution that does whatever Shim6 is supposed to do, right? So I think we have time. We probably have time to get that and get the stuff deployed. Meanwhile, vendors are already building bigger, better, faster memory space for routes and routing. I think the takeaway for me, and hopefully for the people in the room here, is the IETF is the way that this is going to get fixed, regardless of other particular people's opinions about the IETF. And it is very opaque craziness, but unlike here, which is equally opaque and crazy to other people. But the point is that if you came to this BOF and you came away saying, wow, this Shim6 sounds really nutty, I don't think I like this very much. I don't think it solves my problems. You need to go to the IETF meetings or at least participate in the mailing list about Shim6 and do it coherently. Try not to be a crazy man like I do sometimes, and try and make sure that you get your point across, and that the IETF working group chairs, both Jeff and Kurt, who are both very reasonable people, understand your point. And the IAB, it's very nice to have them come and solicit some response from operators, which I noticed that the last two IETFs that I went to, it didn't seem as much operator involvement as I thought there really should be, especially if you start looking at Shim6 and some of the other things that are going on. And as a reason, I should have said who I was too.
Chris.
I'm Chris. I work for MCI Unit. But at a relatively large network operator, I can't get anything done by vendors without really having an RFC to point to and say this either ongoing work in the IETF or this work that's been done describes what my problem is and the solution. You need to implement it. It needs to be implemented to spec. So that that's how we're going to get this fixed. Either spend a lot of money on routers or get somebody to do the right thing with the protocol. So,
that was well said, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this right now, is because we want that kind of input, and we want to have that kind of participation and so forth. So well said.
Yeah. The one last thing is that our nutty errand person, Heather, reminded me 3 times already that the RIRs are all voting on site PI and PA, individual like allocation stuff for v6. So very soon Yahoo will indeed get its own /32 for every data center. This week maybe. Hooray. This week, Heather says, Aaron is voting on independent allocations.
I'll just point out that that's sort of consistent with some of the features that I've heard from different folks in this room, which means that which can have the potential outcome that the IPv4 swamp was tiny.
So,
because you're doing it, right? It's an unaggregatable space now by virtue.
One of the things that I've been saying all week is that, I'm from MCI too, I'm Heather. One of the things I've been saying
What was that?
It doesn't really matter. One of the things I've been saying all week is
it does matter. It does matter. We're taking notes and stuff, and you know, if you say something, we want to be able to point back to who said it.
My name is Heather Skanks. I'm from MCI.
Thank you.
So one of the things I've been saying is that it's interesting in this case that the NANOG part came before Aaron, as it always does, but the policy part about independent end-site allocations is later in the week, and so everybody's working on shim6 stuff and you know, multi-homing stuff, but a big part of this, and you know, what could end up making this not at all needed is if people start getting independent allocations. I mean, you might not be needing to do this work, so it's kind of something to consider.
Right. That in some ways that's like saying there's not a problem. That problem doesn't exist. We just replace it with the other one, right? Right.
I think the point here, though, is that if the provider-independent space gets, Jason Schiller, I'm sorry, Union at MCI. I think if the provider-independent space gets supported by the individual RIR communities, then potentially no one except for home users on DSL and cable modems will be using a shim6 solution for multi-homing and traffic engineering. And I'm not sure how valuable that type of a solution will be if it's only implemented by home users, because you need both sides to be shim6 aware for it to be useful. Your peer-to-peer networking will be great, though.
I think Kathy wants to. Can you hang on one time, Leslie? I think Kathy wants to.
Yeah, I want to say.
Respond to something I might have said inadvertently.
Kathy Aronson, Aaron Advisory Council. I guess the thing I see at the Aaron meetings, and I encourage you guys to come, is that we're not really, a lot of us aren't really keen on the portable address block thing for a lot of reasons, like the other problems that happen. And so we say, well, gee, maybe if we wait a little longer, the problem will really get solved. So we end up in this circle where the policy doesn't change and the problem never gets fixed. So, you know, people need to really start participating in a way that we can solve this.
I'm giving Leslie the last one, and then I have a couple of bullets on the slide I want to run by you guys. So go ahead, please.
Thanks. So Randy's really hard to rebut, but somehow that doesn't stop me from trying. Part of the reason he's so hard to rebut is that he makes his point very clearly and very pointedly. But I think, Randy, the thing that I wanted to get out that perhaps you were overlooking, and I don't want this room to overlook, is I don't actually have an issue if this room says shim6 is DOA. Maybe that's the right conclusion. However, the point I would like everyone to remember is all the other little bits discussed this afternoon and in all the discussions that have led up to here, which is all the problems that you're trying to solve and how they do or do not have a single solution. Pain is going to be conserved whether you do shim6, go back to 8+8 and figure it out or not, and let's not underestimate the fact that there will be pain at some point. So let's make sure we have the notes from all the other things that were said today, and that's part of why the IAB said, yes, let's have a BOF on this and collect more data.
We're operators. Pain is our life.
Okay. Well, this has certainly been interesting, and I thank you all for participating in, because you know, as I said when we started this, I kind of grew up in the community with all of you folks, and now that I'm in the IAB, I want to see if I can't help the IAB with all the other people in the IAB understand more about what the operators are thinking, feeling, and what they think of some of these technologies. So that was really my goal here, and I think the discussion was really great. So so I had this bullet, and it says, was this discussion useful? Well, I mean, I look at it and I go, well, it's really hard to tell, because unless you're able to see the output of what happened here, then it's hard to make that evaluation. But I hope that at some point we can come up with some vectors for input that are useful for folks. And I'm kind of curious to what people think about, you know, this use of their time talking to the IAB folks like this. So, and ways that it could become, that we could make it more useful. I was wondering if people thought this was a good forum to try to do this in, or why not just take it, yeah? I mean, you can, anybody want to, like, do the Jared? This is a good forum for this, huh? See, because we were thinking about, a lot of thinking's gone on about this within the IAB, and one of the things we've been thinking about is kind of taking it on a little bit of a road show so that we're not so geographically you know, North American, and go into some of the other NOGs, which I think would be a good idea too, because different geographies seem to have, as somebody pointed out earlier, different geographies have different kinds of IPv6 deployment profiles. And there'll be a summary and some minutes, and I think this is the right URL. And if it's not, I'll fix it as soon as I know what the right one is. But I think this is it. And
take out the UTGARD IETF.org, and it should be just www.iab.org.
Okay.
Well, it's wrong. That's the temporary address.
Oh, okay. That's wrong. Never mind. That's wrong. We'll post the URL when we get it. But I'm hoping that we all take away from this is sort of a renewed desire to communicate and make the operator and IETF community work a little bit closer together, because as you all know, I mean, I'm of the opinion that, I've always been of the opinion that the IETF should be more operator driven. But, so this is my first chance to try to make it happen, so I'm trying. So anyway, thank you all for coming and participating. I thought it was pretty useful.